Okay, let's get started. So welcome everybody. My name is Ingrid Mulder. I'm part of Davis, and I'm happy to be your host today at this third diversity talk. The diversity talk is a quite inclusive program because it's already a collaboration between Studium Generale, Davis, the Delft Women in Science, through you, the TU Delft Diversity and Inclusion Office, TU Delft, and the TU Delft Feminist. So this already shows a quite inclusive approach, right? So we are happy to bring forward these diversity talks. And today we have our third lecture, and we focus on inclusive design and technology. And we really want to bring diversity and inclusion more to the DNA of TU Delft. So today we have three speakers, two face-to-face. Ivo van der Poel, professor in, how do you should say it, super right, of course, in ethics and technology. We have Lotte Asveld from the Faculty of Applied Science, online on Skype. And afterwards, Servaas Duterloo, the head of the unit Research Funding EU and International Programs, will give a talk. So the program is as follows. They give like 10-minute short talks, and afterwards we like to have an energetic discussion. So if you have really questions that need to be addressed on the moment, post them, raise your hand. But if they can wait, please jot them down and use them in the discussion. Yes? So then I would like to start with Ivo, and I hand over the microphone to you then.
Okay, thank you. I stand up because I found it a bit easier. There's something with the door maybe. But, what I will be doing is saying a few words about inclusive design, what I know from how an approach of inclusive design has been established. I will say a little bit about how this might also affect research, and then I will end with two questions or statements that we can further discuss, and this all in 10 minutes. Inclusive design, this is now more or less becoming a kind of approach that also exists in literature. And for me, I see it mainly as part of what is called, and you might have heard of this term, value-sensitive design, or design for values. So at TU Delft, we now have an institute that is aimed at design for values. And these approaches of value-centered design and design for values, what they do is try to start with values of ethical importance, and then to take these systematically into account into the design process. And this could be, of course, the value of inclusiveness that we're talking about today, but it also involves a lot of other values like privacy, sustainability, safety, and so on and so forth. So this is the approach of value-centered design. It was developed by Batya Friedman in the 1990s in the US for ICT mainly, but now applied to many technologies. So let me also say a bit about inclusive design, at least what I know from it. So there is also quite a tradition now of approaches that are called inclusive design, but you also find it under terms like accessible design, design for usability, but also universal design. So there are different terms which also denote somewhat different approaches. And what you see is that if you look historically, I think it started off with mainly concerns about people with an impairment, with a handicap, access to public buildings, for example. Then a kind of next phase or concern was with the elderly, older people who might also lack, for example, physical strength, so that they cannot use certain devices or lack other capabilities. And from that, also more attention has come, for example, gender issues, because many technologies have a gender bias built in, or are in a sense discriminating in terms of gender. And it might be interesting to think about what kinds of concerns come next. So one interesting and maybe provoking thought is, should we also have religious design, or design that is religiously inclusive, that includes different religions? So I think it is interesting to think about what are exactly the kind of important things here. Then if you look at the approaches, what's interesting is that initially the approaches mainly were developed as design for specific groups. So you had design for the elderly, or you had design for people with an impairment. But I think at least since a decade, probably longer, also another movement has come up, which actually says, no, we should not design for these specific groups. What we should do is design in such a way that everybody can use the technologies. And this is sometimes called countering design exclusion, or it is sometimes called universal design. So that's actually aimed at making the group that can use a design as large as possible by countering design exclusion, rather than designing for specific groups. So this brings me to a first issue that I think is interesting to discuss, because I think there are two different ways of thinking of design for inclusion. One way is like universal design. Say we should make designs that everybody can use, as much people as possible. And for example, and we should of course look at gender, we should look at age, but we should do it in such a way that everybody can use it. Another approach you might call, also to make the difference clear, design for diversity. So that is accepting that different groups are different, and that we should make different design for different groups. And I think this are quite different approaches. So like universal design versus design for diversity. I think that's one interesting thing to discuss. And maybe there is not one answer, or sometimes one is better, sometimes the other is better, but it's something to think of. The second thing I will very briefly want to mention is what this would mean for research, because certainly at TU Delft we do a lot of research. So what's interesting, if you look at, for example, bias in design or in algorithms, very often, and this is true for gender bias, but also racist bias, very often this has to do with the fact that the groups on which technologies are tested, or which groups are included in research, are white male dominated. So one interesting point, and we know this, so one interesting point is, shouldn't we require all research at TU Delft to be also inclusive in this sense, that the groups on which research is being tested should be more diverse than they, I think, often are. And this is interesting because we have rules for research ethics, but it doesn't contain at this moment this type of rule. So I think that's also an interesting point that we could discuss. And here I want to end my introduction.
Okay, Ting, are there any urgent questions for Ibo? I'll wait for the plenary discussion. So, Lotte, I'd like to move to you. Can you hear me? Can you start talking?
So, okay.
Yeah, it's happy. Yeah, you can start. You're on the screen. Okay. You can hear us?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
So, yeah, I can just start? Okay. Yeah, so I've prepared some slides, and what I'm going to tell to you, wait. How do we do that? Yes. So do I now share my slides? I'm not sure. Okay. So I wanted to tell you a bit about research I've been doing on inclusive bio-based innovation. And it connects to the things that Ibo just said. So this is more a case of how you could do inclusion. And this research started from the idea that if you want to have renewable energy, it should go hand in hand with rural development. So you want to have both clean energy and you want to have farmers profit from that energy. So how could you do that? Well, the idea in developing sustainable biomass is that if you develop it in a way that the farmers are also benefiting from it, you will have more sustainable biomass. So the bio-based economy could boost rural development and food security if you take the local conditions into account. So this is for technologies such as biofuels and the energy made from wood. That doesn't work. And in these technologies, farmers and foresters, they play a very important role in the secure supply of biomass. But if you want to do it in a sustainable way, you have to have a just division of benefits and burden. So you have to make sure that all actors benefit from the technology that's been developed. So what our main question was, is how can we align the interests, values and concerns of farmers and people working in forestry with those of other actors in the value chain in order to create a sustainable and secure bio-based value chain? Well, this is what Ivo already mentioned. This is value-sensitive design, and it says that you first identify values. From that you derive norms, and from that you derive design requirements. And that's the approach we took for this case. So Ivo already said, what are moral values? They're for the general goods. They can be things like justice, autonomy, equality. And value-sensitive design is about explicit reflection on how to translate values into design. So for instance, I'm going to skip this. These are the cases that we looked at. So we looked at different countries, and we wanted to see in those countries what is the social context and how can we develop technologies that fit that social context. So, for instance, this is a case we did in Jamaica. We went to Jamaica because there's a big sugarcane availability there. So in this picture, you see representatives of local farmers, and the two women in the middle are two of our researchers. It's Zoe Robey and Sarah Franken. So we went there and we talked to local farmers, we talked what their needs are, and we tried to help them establish good bio-based technologies. So these are some pictures from the sugar mills there. And what we saw is that both farmers are not so well educated, and the technologies that they have available are really, well, not as refined, sophisticated as we have in Europe. So these were some of the conditions we were facing there. So what did this mean for us? Well, so as I said, we've been looking at different case studies, and we had some initial findings. First, that we saw from the literature and the interviews that everybody told us farmers value freedom very much. Every farmer wants to be free in different ways. But this value of freedom and different things in different contexts. So, for instance, in the South African case that we also have, people say what is most important for these farmers is to have a choice. They want to be free to choose what they do with their crop. They want to be free to sell it to whomever they want. But if you go to Jamaica, that's not the same, they don't have the same perception on it. In Jamaica, people felt freedom doesn't mean that you have necessarily having a choice, it means you have your own land. And this has to do with the fact that in Jamaica, there used to be a slave country, there was a lot of slaves, and when they were freed, they were all given their own piece of land. So for these people, freedom is still very much connected to ownership of the land, and not so much towards having a choice. They care a lot less about having their own choice. They don't care to who they sell their products. They just want to have their own land. So you can see that in different contexts, different values have different meanings. And this has implications for the kinds of contracts that you, for instance, have, for the responsibilities that you share with people. We also looked at the US, and as you probably know, in the US, freedom is a very important value, and there it turned out to mean something different again. So this is the ethanol plant developed by DSM in the Iowa, which is like a very corn-rich country, and it's a very innovative technology. And what we found there is that what is important to these farmers is that they control their production facilities. So DSM offered for them to rent the equipment, but they don't want that. They want to own their own equipment. So for these farmers, freedom is owning your own equipment. So how do you then design for freedom if it means different things in different contexts? So I think this is also relates to what Ibo said about universal design and design for diversity. Freedom is a universal value, but it can mean different things in different contexts. So you could have these norms, so allow different norms in different contexts. So in one context, it could be allow for freedom of choice. And in other contexts, it could be secure ownership of land, or it could mean support ownership of machinery, which leads to different design requirements for a bio-based value chain. So, well, you could have all these different design requirements. And the questions this raised for me was also related to the things that Ibo said. So if you want to be inclusive and you are faced with conditions such as in Jamaica, where you have very poor farmers who are not well educated and who have very poor equipment, do you then design for poor people with poor equipment? Or do you try to also emancipate these people? And do you see it as your duty to change their situation? Like, do you accept the situation that they're in? Or do you think you should alter that? And I think, yes, you could say that you should try to improve people's context and not just design for it. And this leads me to another question. So whose values take precedence? If you design for inclusion in a global context and you want to include, for instance, people in a society where there's gender equality, do you design it based on the assumption of gender equality, or do you design taking into account that in this specific context there is gender inequality and people might accept your technology more easily if you design it in such a way? So I think if you try to be inclusive in a global context, which is what we try to do, the conflict between universal design and design for diversity becomes very pressing. So yeah, that was my main question.
Okay, thank you. Any urgent questions for Lotte? No, because I really like to go in the discussion on this question on whose value, and also how the difference between, well, educating and living here at Delft, how that is different to the situation you are referring to. And indeed, how are our values kind of in influencing the other context? Are we able to set up the slides as well? So I just start talking. Oh, okay, sorry. But Lotte, you're with us, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Somewhere. Okay. So my name is Servaas Duterloo, and I'm responsible within the TU Delft for quite a strange job. When I studied, I didn't know it existed, but the team I lead, they support researchers to apply for funding, and the funding is provided for a large part by the European Union. And they have this lovely flag, and I'm a great fan of flags. And always when I give a presentation, I put the European flag and a flag which is relevant to the topic. So that's why you see this flag there. And when I have guests or meetings with people from other countries, then of course, then there is another flag. So my talk is on diversity and inclusivity in the policy of the EU, in the field of research, and on funding, because there's even funding for it. Now, when I was asked to give this talk, I had to dive into a bit of the history of it and the relevance. And here are some of the people that I thought of who are very inspiring for this domain of inclusivity and diversity. And I don't know whether any of you know who these people are. So on the left top, anybody? This is a bunch of ladies in 1907, and they were the first ladies who were in the Finnish parliament. So, how relevant is that? The guys down here, these two old men, that's Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman, and they are the founders of the European Union. You know, after long wars, they set up the European Union. The lady here, she rallied for the vote for women in Britain, Emily Pankhurst. Anyway, I can go on and on and on, and there are many more, but just to inspire you. I've taken all the space you can put on the slide to fill it up with text. As you can see, I really did my best here. And these are some of the trends that I came across in preparing this talk. So what is happening? You see, there's transhumanism. Today on the radio, there was a talk about people under the age of 18 who cannot go to cosmetics to get a filler in their lips to improve, you know, their how they are. You know, another thing is another development is the whole discussion about gender self-identification. We even had a guy in the Netherlands who wanted to be younger and who doesn't want to be younger, and he went to court and he asked, "My age is 69 and I want to be a lot younger. So, you know, why is that possible?" And he was declined. So there's a lot to look at. One of the most inspiring I found is Christine Lagarde. She's a French lady who heads up the International Monetary Fund. She's written a column in The Economist, I think it was. 2%, when you have a bank account, 98% of the CEOs are men. But Christine Lagarde, she's heading up IMF. In the Netherlands, also just a few steps we've taken in the past, just to see the progress. It's 100 years this year that we have voted for half the population more than we had 100 years ago. That's staggering. 2001, the right to same-sex marriage. So all these steps are taken, but very slowly. And that gives you to wonder what Europe does. The Netherlands was sort of screened last year in the 2018 report, and gender is still up for improvement. So there's always work to do. Anyway, the policy of the EU on the European research area, this is a system of the EU to scan and give recommendations to member states to improve the research. Oh, the doors are open, it's very inclusive. Come on then. To improve the research done, you know, and the conditions under which research can take place, such here as in Delft. And one of the important topics there is gender equality and gender mainstreaming in research. And that is split down in 3 objectives, where you can see also the gender dimensions in research content. You know, people developing medication, and they only test it on men, and then prescribe it to children, for example. And then, you know, things go wrong. You know a lot more about it, I think, with even a project. Yeah, the conclusion here is that for all countries make progress, but some are better than others. So for Europe, it is still a challenge. And we're only talking in the European research area about gender. not about diversity in a wider sense. Now, if you look at the EU itself, you know, you have the Commission. I don't know whether you're familiar with all these people who are working there. One of the important ones is Jean-Claude Juncker. He's like the president. He has 28 members because there are 28 member states, and 9 of the Commission members are women. In Parliament, 37%. 751 members at this moment. So, but then the EU also received the Nobel Prize for Peace. So they're doing something right, you know, if the Nobel Prize is the criterion of success. Also, a nice milestone, I think, is a study. It was largely conducted by people from the University of Utrecht on trans and intersex equality rights in the EU. That's 2012. That's fairly recent. Then EU research funding itself. All proposals that researchers submit to the EU, and these proposals are evaluated by evaluators who are selected for their knowledge of the field. All these proposals have to describe how they handle the gender dimension. So in the research itself, in the balance of the consortium, so who's taking part, why there are less women than men, why that is, you know, is there anything? Also, they have to look at ethics, that is also important. And it is really something that you have to be aware of as a researcher when you write your proposal. It's not always easy, but it has to be done. Then the research that researchers can obtain is described on the websites of the EU and in work programs. And these work programs describe all the topics. And one of the work programs is called Europe in a Changing World, Inclusive, Innovative and Reflective Societies. And what I did just for you, to get an understanding how relevant this discussion is, the word gender is mentioned 26 times, inclusion 18, and diversity 10 times. I don't think that's not bad, but these are the topics researchers can submit proposals to. So there is an awareness of these terms. The same goes for another work program in which you also find a lot of topics, Science with for Society. Their gender is mentioned 178 times, so they're really, you know, on 54 pages. That's on average 3 times on every page, I think. It was 156, so in the draft. And that means when the draft is ready, then a lot of people are consulted and people write to the people of the Commission and say, there should be more of these topics in research. So gender has even been improved. So that's a little positive thing. If you compare one draft with another, looking at the numbers, simply the sheer numbers, that adds up nicely. However, inclusion only 4 times. So that's still work to be done. Diversity 3 times. And 2 times that was biodiversity, between brackets. This just gives you an impression how the EU is struggling maybe or taking steps with this topic, with the phenomenon of inclusion and diversity. And I think they're making progress. And what is important to know is that these work programs, they are a very long process of consultation with stakeholders in Europe. So with everyone, with mostly everyone. Consultation committees with member state representatives, organizations, etc., who take part and encourage the EU to do something in the interest of that particular stakeholder. Now, knowing that the statistics on participation of women in science is not so good, 2 research topics came up. That's access to grants and gender dimension, and analyzing gender gaps and biases in the allocation of grants. So there's something going on. Obviously, they want to, you know, where there's smoke, there's fire. They want to investigate this further, and they have put up a call to do some research in this domain. Now, I still have 45 seconds, and far too much information on the slides. But another area where the EU is active is for disabled people. They have to be catered for in a different way in life, in education, equal opportunities. So there is serious research also in this domain, but also serious policy making. I stop very soon. There was a progress report that is also real lingo for the EU to explain that not a lot of progress is made, but you make a progress report on all policies to evaluate, etc. So they've done that, and this is what came out in a short sentence. Read it afterwards, because I have to hurry. Some lessons learned. It's simply, I learned that Japanese, ippo ippo. Is anyone familiar with that? It means small steps, slowly, and that is what the EU is doing in this domain of inclusivity and diversity. And many ways to influence it is that in May there are European elections for a whole new parliament. So all these 751 members seats are ready for a campaign. Now, and here are some sources for further reading, and to throw out, I have this nice quote of Steve Jobs, but I think many of you know that. Thank you.
So maybe as a first question, can other speakers say, like, you're kind of expert on the topic, but you're also a colleague here in Delft. So what would be the first great steps to get Delft more leading in inclusion and diversity based on your research? Would you kick it off?
Just to be clear, do you mean for my own, or what Delft should do? What's your question exactly?
Well, just more. It's not. You can answer it a little bit more broader, but on the efforts, you know more about inclusion than the efforts to your Delft employee, right? In that sense. So, from your insights, what would you say that would be great if I can just bring this message to Delft, or what can Delft do in order to talk more diversity?
Yeah, I would say that one of the main things that maybe is, starting with aware. I mean, I think there is a lot of implicit exclusion, also in doing research. So, I mean, we at Delft we develop many new designs, technologies, devices, and I think that the ones developing them, and I'm not saying everyone, but that there can still be much more awareness that often you're having assumptions, for example, about your users, about how something is to be used, that are just based on what you think yourself, but that might exclude other genders, might exclude other religions, might exclude other nationalities, races, and also I think, and that might become even more important, if you're doing research with, for example, you're testing out a prototype on a group, you will often do here on students, I think. Now, our students, I mean, it's very obvious that they are not representative of the world population. I mean, so I think implicitly by testing out on our students, we having a form of exclusion of certain target groups. And it's not deliberate, I'm saying, but first of all, we should be aware that there's much more exclusion, usually unintended, I think, but there's much more exclusion than we are aware of. And I think the first thing is to become aware, and the second thing is then to think what are also practical ways, and I mean, we cannot maybe change the world overnight, but we can think of what are practical ways in which we can counter some of that exclusion.
always a very clear question in these topics, because you're saying you have to be less exclusive. But you think that being more diverse is necessary to be more inclusive?
Well, for me, and this is a bit in line with, I think there are two things. So one thing is just to be aware of assumptions or setups in your research that actually exclude certain groups. So, for example, I mean, I'm a white male, so I might, if I develop something, I might not be aware that for example, women or for people from other race, things I assume might not apply. So that is countering exclusion. I think taking into account diversity is still a step further, because that is actively thinking about what other groups might need or might be important for them. So for me, a first step would be to be aware of your own assumptions and to see whether they also apply to others. And something more is to be aware of what is specific for other groups and whether you want to take that into account. Do you understand the difference I make? Yeah.
So maybe
Lotte?
you want to contribute to that?
Sorry? You're talking to me?
It's quite difficult also for me. So this inclusive technology, how to move in your area. Can you see?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So we were debating on the role of the researcher, and you stressed very nicely.
Yes, thank you.
What is, yeah, I see you over there.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So whose values are you taking into account? You raised that as a serious point, and I really value that, because, yeah, you are a Delft researcher, part of the elite, going to the other side of the world. So can you reflect on that?
Yeah, so as I said, when doing this research in an international context, really made me wonder. So if you think that some values are important, but in a specific society, not everybody recognizes that, how do you deal with that? Can inclusive design also be transformative in a way that it sort of triggers certain values in people that they might not articulate themselves, but that you might think of something that might be good for them? And is that also inclusion if you try to emancipate people through your design? I find that a difficult question to answer, actually. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Somebody of the audience want to contribute to that?
Hi, my name is Olya. Thank you very much for this wonderful speech. So it's not necessarily a feedback to that, it's a separate question. Is that okay? So I love the presentations of all the speakers, and it was interesting how they mostly tackled the issue of inclusive design, universal design. But for me, at least, how I understand it, when we talk about universal design, it necessitates, it requires some kind of political philosophy that supports designers to implement these decisions. So I was thinking, how can, perhaps a question more to Ibo, but also to all of the speakers, how can philosophers also support these pursuits of universal design, of inclusive design, with a theory that accounts for different users with different needs? And here I'm not talking specifically just about value change, of course value change, but also redistribution of resources, not just between people, but between public goods, that not only abstracts from these individual users, but takes them into account. And that's, I see it as a big challenge.
Okay, I try to I'm not sure whether I can completely answer that. I would say, and this relates also to Lotte's question, that if you think what should we design for, and things like I think we should have a normative notion of what it means to be a human being. And I'm thinking, for example, of the capability approach of Martha Nussbaum. I don't know if people are aware of that, but Martha Nussbaum, also Amartya Sen has worked on the capability approach. Martha Nussbaum has an approach that says there are something like 10 or 14 basic human capabilities that every human should have. And what they they're free to use them in different ways. So there is room for diversity, but there is also something universal, namely that everybody should have access to these capabilities. And what's interesting about this approach is that because she is discussing, and this relates to things that Lotte said, she's discussing, for example, empirical research show if you ask people in women in India that are in a suppressed position, they don't desire certain freedoms.
Yeah.
Now, if you put the same women in a position of freedom, they want these freedoms. So the problem is that just asking people doesn't always give the things that are important to them. They should be in the right position. And that is exactly what she tries to address with this capability approach, having a number of capabilities that everybody should have access to, which is in a sense universal, but at the same time saying that how people use these capabilities, how they express themselves, they should have freedom to do that differently. But I think the point is that we need something like a normative philosophical notion of what it means to be a human being, because otherwise it is not just doing what the people say they want. So, but at the same time, you should of course not completely ignore what people say they want. So, and I think this approach, this capability approach, is quite a nice way to, end up in the middle, so to say.
Hi, thank you very much to all the speakers. My name's Amy Thomas. I'm in the Department of Architecture, but I'm also here with my hat on as part of the management team for Delft Design for Values. My question is a little bit more about the institution as a framework for this kind of research. And as a technical school, but generally as a university, we're particularly focused on this excuse me, idea of excellence. Excellence in research, excellence in teaching. And I'm wondering if the three speakers could perhaps offer some insights as to how they think this concept of excellence could be reframed or redeveloped with the ideas of diversity and inclusion in mind. Because as it currently stands, I don't think excellence has a broad enough definition and doesn't necessarily take into account these kinds of ideas.
Thank you. Who wants to pass the mic? Servaas, do you want to kick it up? Because I think you gave some kind of nice policies from the EU, but...
Yeah, excellence is really, to talk about Horizon 2020, that is the program which is now running. And TU Delft is quite successful in obtaining funding from that, particularly in the domain of excellence. And excellence and inclusivity and diversity, that is a complex one. I think what I try to find out, for example, is I didn't count that I had the numbers of members of parliament and the gender balance there. I didn't look at the ERC grants, but they are all listed. And then you see the names, and these names, I assume, are the names of men or women. And I can go by the names which sound familiar and say, oh, that is a name of a female researcher, but that's not necessarily. So I didn't go and check that balance, but I know from the topics I showed that there is a gender bias in the evaluation process. There is, it cannot be that as you saw, 2% of the bankers, if they are really excellent, or the 98% are really excellent CEOs, and they're all male, and there's 2% who are female, that is of course strange, because that statistically already you smell the smoking gun that there's something wrong. So in excellence, probably there is something as well, but it is very hard to objectively put the finger on the sore spot and say this is what is wrong. And that's why the EU is doing research in that domain. And I think there may be room for improvement within TU Delft as well. That is for sure. Yeah. Is that an answer to your question? Yeah. Okay, we have I know the HR department, they have looked at gender equality plans and to work on that. And that's in the field of talent management and encouraging researchers, etc. I don't know about the latest on that, but I'll look into it. So. Yeah?
So I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I really have an answer, but I think it's a very interesting issue. So, and for me, and I'm not having an answer, so on the one hand you could argue it is about how we understand the notion of excellence, and we should maybe have a broader notion of excellence. But you can also question whether, I mean, we know that certain notions of values are associated with male and certain other notions with female, which actually changes over time. And this I don't know about excellence, but it could be that people implicitly associate excellence with men rather than with women. And if that's the case, the notion itself might be problematic to use, or we might need to think about that. So I know, for example, you have now checkers for job advertisements. You can check them whether they contain mainly male or female terms, and that seems to have an implicit, so not an explicit, but an implicit effect on which people apply. So if you put a lot of male terms in, you get more male applicants, and you put a lot of female terms in, you get more female. And it would be interesting, I don't know, whether excellent is one of these male terms, because if that's the case, the problem might also be with using the word excellence and not just only how we understand excellence. So.
Continuing that question, is excellence then having high grades or having your grants applied, or is it being successful at teaching or at different thing? Because you answered the question from frame that you're saying that only if you're having success, that's called excellence in a very narrow way for having your grants applied and having, and we're here, male and female on the TU Delft, they're all quite excellent in terms of being able to complete your educations, but maybe it's more than that.
So I think we certainly should think about what we call excellence, so what we find excellent, and we should think about that and broaden that. But the other thing I meant to say is that, and that's partly it's just a cultural process. I mean, we know that it's a cultural process that certain terms get associated with men and other terms get associated with women. That's something that just happens culturally, whether we like it or not. I mean, and that actually also changes over time. But if that's the case, what these words do, these words are not just neutral words, they direct our thinking in certain directions. Now, I don't know if this is the case, but suppose that it is the case that the term excellent is associated automatically, culturally, in many people's minds with males. Using the word already biases you towards thinking, if that word is being used, oh, that must be a male. And this is not happening deliberately, but this has happened unconsciously. That's what I mean. And we all think, of course, I also think, well, this is not happening to me. But we know from research that at the cultural level, these things just happen, whether we like it or not. So this is also something just to be aware of. That's what I mean to say. But maybe that's not your question, I don't know.
Yes. Yeah, I just, I'm a little bit troubled by the reference back to the gender binary of being what diversity means. I think most people in this room will understand diversity to mean ethnic diversity, to mean diversity in terms of gender, or not a binary approach to gender too, and also sexuality. So I think it's important to acknowledge this wider concept of diversity when we're talking about it. We're not just talking about male-female gender balance, but also encompassing a wider group of individuals into this conversation.
I like the point as well that you say the people in this room are of course more aware than the others not coming to this kind of talks. And I think that's already, so we are not the TU Delft in that sense, you know, this is like a very small percentage of the people around on the campus.
Yep.
Yeah. And also there's a question, and I have to run up again.
Okay, Lotte, this is for you and Ibo too maybe. You talked about differences in values, but what about contrasts in values? So when you go to a place, and of course it's not one homogeneous community, there are different interests, different colliding values, or even when you consider a wider scope, right, between the specific community and the society in which it lives, between specific environmental values that are important maybe for the community and other environmental values that might be important for the country in which it resides or even to the world. How do you go about deciding, really, rather than reconciling, which values you're going to design for or highlight in your research?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, can I say something? So I think a first step is already to recognize that there are conflicting values. I think that's already a step moving forward when you want to do inclusive design, that you know that there are conflicting values. What I see around me, sometimes people don't even recognize that there might be conflicts. And then how do you decide which one is more important, or how do you reconcile that? Sometimes it's possible to reconcile different values if you recognize them. I don't have a good example now, but maybe the signs for toilets where you have like male, female, and then half male, half female is like trying to offer different options to different people with different interests. But at other times, you cannot reconcile all the values, but then at least you are urged, you are invited to reflect on why you think a certain value would be more important than another. And I think, yeah, you should see that as something valuable in itself, even if you don't know what the final answer would be.
Yeah, and I think that's also a very engineering thing, you know, always looking for the right solution, but just acknowledging that we think different on each is already a first step, right?
Yes.
So I now go to the guy here that has a question for Poel and allow you to pose it.
Thank you for the interesting speech. I have a question which is related to the earlier question to Lotte. So is inclusion about having giving precedence to a particular set of values, or is it about one set of values influencing the other, or is it also about okay, two set of values can coexist? Could you briefly reflect on that?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think it's possible for two sets of values to coexist. So we have production systems that cater to different values. So you have meat for people who think animal welfare is very important, and we have a meat that's very important for people with religious convictions. So sometimes we can have different production systems next to each other. But there's also cases where we can't. So it depends a bit on the kind of technology that you develop. When there is a consumer product, I think it's easier that if you design something that is more systematic, like an energy system, then it's more difficult to combine different values.
Okay, is that answering you? So we are about 12:30, 1:30, sorry. There's room for one last question? Nobody? Liz? You? Two brief questions?
Yeah, question for research when you want to design something for diversity so it fits more characteristics. I found it quite complicated to define what the diversity is, because within this action you also differentiate already, and this can also be kind of like a top-down process where you decide what the diversity is, which doesn't really seem to be ethical correct. So I was wondering how you take this into account within your research. So it's more like labeling instead of that a group defines itself.
Do you want to say something?
Well, I think that people identify with designs, and that identity is very important, and it is also a very, well, it's a trend at this moment, which influences how things are designed or whether a design is appealing. And when you think of universal design, which was raised earlier as well, I also think, for example, of inclusion, exclusion of ATMs, cash machines. They're all taken away, and the people who use cash cannot use the cash anymore because it's not being distributed because of the bank robbers. So there are many aspects of that, but identity is certainly important, and I think also simply the freedom of choice. And freedom of choice is hard these days because you have surveillance capitalism, and they just tell you what you like, and they know what you like before you know it.
You have a quick question?
Maybe for the three of you, who is going to set these capabilities or this definition of human being or well-being for humans? Is it going to be the same organisms who are always biased and don't know why they are biased at a global level and also at a TU level?
So who kicks off?
Because I started talking about these capabilities. So, so actually this is quite a discussion. So what Martha Nussbaum did, Martha Nussbaum actually, she tried to define these capabilities, but to do it in a kind of global process. So she talked at many places in the world with people about these capabilities, trying to come to a list of I think 12 capabilities. But it is interesting, Amartya Sen opposes her approach. So Amartya Sen says we should not predefine, these should also be defined by the people themselves in a specific place and location. So actually there is controversy about, and I think there is to be said something for both, because you could, I think the good thing about Amartya Sen's point is that indeed you want to be open to all voices, but like the example I gave of the women in India, you should realize that if people in a suppressed position, they might not be able to see all the capabilities. So in a sense, it is more complicated than just listening to the people. So, but I certainly think we should be very much aware that it doesn't become a kind of one-sided process, and that this is very still open for discussion and change. But I think if you see what Martha Nussbaum tried to do, she at least tried to be very open and not just to make it some kind of Western thing. I mean, that was clearly her attempt.
Okay, so thank you all. Thank you for participating in it, and thank you for being speaker here in the room and online. Thank you. So please give them a hand, and then